The Second World War is generally regarded as a bad thing, with cities destroyed, countries' infrastructure damaged and economies ruined, whole continents of people malnourished and in some cases starving, and over 60 million dead. It's difficult to find the positives. But there were lessons to be learnt about not letting dictators with extreme nationalistic views into power, and the importance of a functioning international rules-based order across the world, which unfortunately seem to be lessons that we have now forgotten. However, the more lasting legacy was what engineers achieved in advancing technology due to the pressures of conflict. And two advances in particular stand out, which over the latter half of the 20th century transformed the human condition. The first advance is exemplified by the B-29 Superfortress bomber. This was a massive development effort which cost half as much again as the atom bomb that it went on to carry. And the key point here is that it was so complex no one person can understand it all. It represents the birth of systems engineering, the means by which groups of engineers can create things that are beyond the comprehension of a single human being. Now, in aviation, it led to aircraft that can take us anywhere on Earth in less than a day, transforming the way the world works. But it was not just in aviation. Systems engineering has been applied more widely and has led to more and more complex things in more and more fields. Which brings us to the second legacy of World War II, the invention of the digital computer. The digital computer also soon became so complex that no one person can understand them. Indeed, it was the computing community that actually invented the term systems engineering. Since the Second World War, the power, sophistication and increasing range of applications for computers had led them to being everywhere and in everything. So you will soon be able to hold a conversation with your dishwasher on the metaphysics of self-consciousness while it's on its final rinse cycle. Not that those would be the two things that people in 1945 would have listed as the technology marvels that had been spawned from the war. Systems engineering was too subtle to be noticed, and computing too secret. The two things the post-war generation would have pointed to were rockets that could go into space and atomic power, although as things turned out, neither had the level of impact of systems engineering or computers. So the post-war world thought that it had entered the atomic age or the space age, select as appropriate for the newspaper headline of the moment. Today, using either term would seem somehow odd and inappropriate, but for decades to come, the world would use both terms with relish and obsess itself with what happens if you put the two things together. And Hollywood was just as obsessed with this as everybody else, and this is important background to any science fiction film made in the 1950s. And that starts with this video's subject, George Powell's Destination Moon. Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsell, the rocket scientist of the title, but more accurately, I'm an astronautical systems engineer. And I'm looking at films that depict space and assessing how they influence humanity's perception of the universe and spaceflight. So, we're now 10 years after the final Flash Gordon serial, and the decade has been, well, a bit thin on space films of any significance. But then we get to this, a real biggie. The 1950 Destination Moon. This is the first film in the English-speaking world to take spaceflight as a serious possibility. Of course, as we've already seen, in the pre-war non-English-speaking world, there were some stunning examples of serious, realistic spaceflight movies. But who in California is going to take notice of obscure European films that have been banned? Destination Moon was also intended to be the first space film since the Second World War, which was significant as it was the Second World War that took spaceflight in the public consciousness from a fantasy to a reality. The V2 had been the first man-made object to reach space, so in a very limited way spaceflight had actually happened, and everybody was aware of it. Another post-war change was the wider availability of Technicolor. It was still an expensive process, so only top-tier blockbusters would use it, and most movies, even from the major studios, were still being made in black and white. So this was a further statement of intent that this was going to be the first colour space movie. This follows a pattern that we've seen before, and we will see it again. Whenever a new movie technology is developed to enhance the audience experience, somebody makes a space film to exploit it. And so the film Destination Moon was going to be Hollywood reflecting the potential of this new post-war technology reality, using the best tools at its disposal. This is a first man on the moon story of the type that we've seen before in pre-war cinema, and it was the story that's always turned to if you want to appear serious and not just fantasy. So the basic story here is pretty standard fare. And for such an unoriginal basic story, it required a surprisingly large scriptwriting team. Destination Moon has 3 credited screenplay writers, including Robert Heinlein, who would go on to become one of the 3 golden age greats of science fiction. But at this time, although his co-writing career was about a decade old, his novel publishing career was only just starting. So like many of the films with standout technical aspects, there is a major figure behind it with some claim to astronautical expertise. The film's story has many elements from Heinlein's works around this time, including the technical assumptions, which are outlined in a long expositions and explanations scene. This includes nearly 5 minutes of a Woody Woodpecker cartoon who starts by emphasising the reality of spaceflight, citing the number of articles in magazines, which of course is always a good way to determine life's realities, and then goes on to explain the basics of rocket flight, and I do mean the very basics. And for some reason this requires guns. Well, I guess this is America. All this explanation was part of a sales pitch to major industrialists who the team seemed to think would foot the bill because it was too expensive for governments. I saw this film in the 1960s with the Apollo programme taking at its peak 5.5% of the federal budget. And my, how we laughed at this naive notion of privately funded human spaceflight. But perhaps we should note this caveat in the film.
Only American industry can do this job. And American industry must get to work now, just as we did in the last war.
Yes, but the government footed the bills.
And they'll foot this bill, too, if we're successful, you know that.
Which is pretty much what is happening now. So where does this small government thinking come from? Well, maybe from Heinlein. Although his actual political views are very difficult to pin down, partly because they clearly changed quite radically over time, but also that his novels often explored a political concept which he clearly didn't fully endorse or believe in. But it seems as if he moved from a liberal position towards a more conservative position, and his third wife Virginia may have been an influence here. What is certain is that the 2 novels on which Destination Moon is generally agreed to be based both show that he has an interest in non-government flight to the moon. But Heinlein's influence can be more clearly seen in the technical aspects of the film. Here is an explanation of the spaceship's propulsion.
All this space below carries the working fluid, the reaction mass. It's water heated to dry steam by the atomic pile and expelled through this jet.
So this is an example of post-war combining rockets and atomic power, in this case with a positive outcome. Now, nuclear rockets as a concept came very quickly once the reality of nuclear power was grasped, starting with ideas from the atomic bomb team at Los Alamos, but this work was classified. However, the basic idea is so obvious that others also grasped the concept, and by 1947 a number of rocket researchers in both the USA and in Britain had published detailed assessments on how to do it. So nuclear rockets are a real thing. They must be. They were mentioned in the 1949 Life article, which shows the improvement they offer, although the important detail the article misses is that to get this performance you need to use hydrogen as the propellant. But even more convincing than a magazine article is that in the early 1960s NASA and the Atomic Energy Commission actually made and test-fired a series of nuclear engines in Nevada. So how do they work? A nuclear rocket is an example of a thermodynamic rocket. This is where the reaction mass is hot gases. If you have a container full of gas, then the pressure on the walls all balances out. But if you make a hole in the bottom, then there's more pressure force on the top surface than the bottom surface, and this creates a force that moves the vehicle. What you then do is shape the hole to maximize the force, which is called a nozzle. Ultimately, the exhaust velocity comes from the movement of the gas molecules bouncing around in the chamber. If the temperature goes up, then the molecules move faster and consequently the exhaust velocity increases, which is good. So we want to get as high a temperature in the chamber as we can. But if the gas molecules are heavier, then their velocity is slower for a given temperature, and so the exhaust velocity drops. So the objective is always to get the lowest molecular weight gases you can. A simple nuclear rocket works by pushing the propellant through the reactor, heating it up and then exhausting it through the nozzle. The heating coming from the reactor. So the maximum temperature is governed by how hot the reactor can get without melting. Whereas in a chemical rocket, the energy comes from the reaction of the two chemicals. If it is a hydrogen-oxygen rocket, then the propellant is water, which is the same exhaust propellant as in the engine in Destination Moon. So let's compare them. In the chemical, we can add a little extra hydrogen and lower the average molecular weight, so the performance goes up. And without a reactor to worry about, we can raise the temperature in the thrust chamber. So again, the chemical has a better performance. And finally, without a heavy reactor, the dry mass of the chemical system is much lighter. So overall, a simple hydrogen-oxygen chemical rocket will always have better performance than a water nuclear rocket. And neither could go from the Earth's surface to the moon, let alone get back. So, apart from the advantage that quite literally you could piss in the tanks to extend the range, a tiny amount, a water nuclear rocket is a terrible idea. So where did the film get the notion that water would be a good propellant? Well, the circumstantial evidence rather points to Heinlein, who in his novel Rocket Ship Galileo has a nuclear rocket with zinc propellant, which is even worse than water. And there's a discussion about using lead, which is worse still, which shows that despite his science background and having a wife whose job was rocket engine testing, he did not understand the fundamentals of how they worked. So what is the promise of nuclear rockets? Well, a hydrogen-oxygen chemical rocket can achieve an exhaust velocity of around 4.5 kilometers a second in a vacuum, whereas a nuclear rocket, if and only if it uses hydrogen as the propellant, can reach 8 kilometers a second. Now, this is clearly a substantial improvement, but the engine and propellant tanks are much heavier. So the overall effect is, while there is some advantage, it does not massively change what can be done. So it's a bit debatable as to whether it is worth the effort. However, there is a way to take nuclear engines to where they can genuinely become game changers, which is to add electrical heating to the thrust chamber. This can take the exhaust velocity to 12.5 kilometers a second. Now, it does make the engine a little more complex, like this Serpent engine, which was invented by Alan Bond. But it enables vehicles like this Scorpion that can go from low Earth orbit to the moon's surface and return without the need to refuel. But even this technology which is way beyond what could have been envisaged in 1950, does not enable a practical ship that can take off from the Earth, go to the moon and then return. Even if nuclear rockets are not the magic solution that they appeared to be in the early 1950s, and we take this as an honest overestimate of what is possible, then we can give George Pal credit for taking efforts to predict the reality of spaceflight. Nevertheless, he always seems to just somehow miss the target. For example, look at the effort made here to portray the forces on takeoff. Now, the effect is impressive, but is also entirely inaccurate. If the forces were this high, the crew would be at risk of serious injury. But never mind the crew, what about the lovely spaceship? If these are the forces imposed on the structure, it has to be strong enough to take them. And that makes it heavier, and that reduces the overall performance. In reality, the thrust of launch systems are tailored to reduce forces during takeoff for the sake of both the passengers and the vehicle itself. And we know the rocket engine on this spaceship has a high degree of thrust control because it later performed the lunar landing in a much lower gravity field and when the vehicle itself is much lighter. The weightless scenes are also rather clunky. They acknowledge that in space the crew would be in microgravity, and they have a scene with an enormous travel pill to show it. But despite this, and however they arrange things, it never seems quite right, especially after seeing so many real shots of people in space. It took me a long time to work out why it looked so wrong, and I think it is because not only are they sitting down, which no one actually does in microgravity, but it's the way they sit down. You can see the weight. And it's the same story when they reach the moon. They do a few set-up shots that show that the gravity is lower. But once that's been done, they then act as if it was entirely Earth gravity. And if you're thinking, well, this was before we had real pictures from space, well, yes, and time has not been kind. Despite their efforts, as real spaceflight became a thing to compare with, the space scenes have not worn well. But the 1930s European films were far more realistic and have worn well, and I think in large part that is because they stuck with simulating the low gravity environment for every shot and thus maintained the illusion. So Destination Moon, while trying hard, technically it's not quite right. But does that matter when it comes to a piece of cinematic art? In other words, is there a good gripping plot to balance the preachy bits? Well, I'm afraid not. The story is very episodic. Yes, the crew have perilous events that they have to face and resolve, but they are random and isolated, and the resolution happens immediately with the event. So while each event is realistic and believable, they are completely disconnected and do not make a linked up plot with one event leading to another and developing characters. So the movie ends up, well, a little bit flat. As for the acting,
The thing won't work. It can't. It's crazy. Figure all that weight. It won't budge an inch. And what do I see 'em putting in the fuel tanks? Water. You're all gonna look like a bunch of dummies.
that was Dick Wesson in his film debut, being the comic relief who needs everything explained. In a cringeworthy performance, but let's face it, really none of the performances were going to be trouble in the Oscars that year. But the effects and art direction were a different story. It was nominated for both and it won the effects Oscar. And for the time you can understand why. So A+ for effects. And I'm going to give it, technical accuracy an A-, mostly for effort rather than the end result. And of course C+ for the story, mostly because there isn't much of a one. And the acting is also, well, come on, it's in the C territory. So can Destination Moon redeem itself with some philosophical insight as to the role spaceflight might play as humanity progresses to a bright and better future? After all, if you want to promote a future for mankind in space, the why is probably more important and more interesting to the audience than the technical how. Many good stories never explain the mechanics of what's going on, but no good story misses out on the motivation of the protagonists. Well, Here's the argument that they used to convince the Assembly of Industrialists.
The race is on, and we'd better win it, because there is absolutely no way to stop an attack from outer space. The first country that can use the moon for the launching of missiles will control the Earth.
This is an argument that was seriously made elsewhere in the 1950s, and it's stupid level wrong. Missiles on the moon would take days to reach Earth, and everybody could see them coming. Fortunately for the credibility of people advocating astronautics, this particular piece of silliness disappears by the mid-1950s. But it reflects the post-war obsession with nuclear weapons, and the nonsense of the proposition might not have been apparent to the audience at the time. So what was the impact of the film? Well, it did okay at the box office. On a budget of $600,000, it had a global return of around $5 million, which was a very respectable but not spectacular return. The comments and reviews at the time were polite rather than enthusing, emphasising the spectacle rather than the entertaining plot and the thrilling action. Arthur C. Clarke, who was bound to be positive about the film's intentions, and yes, this comes across in his review. But is this a review that makes you want to see it, unless you are a spaceflight enthusiast already? In which case, all the astronautics for dummies stuff is, well, rather wasted. Well, whether technically accurate or not, in hindsight, this spectacular education piece is rather heavy-handed, even ponderous. And although George Powell's intentions might well be to educate the public and enthuse them for the future of humanity in space, generally audiences do not buy their cinema tickets with their hard-earned money to be educated. What they want is an entertaining plot and some thrilling action. But despite this weakness, it was widely seen then and later on. It was a staple on TV, which is where I first saw it. But did it actually educate the general public as intended? Well, I'm going to argue probably not. There were many other space films which were just as widely seen and far less accurate by anybody's standards. And I really doubt that the general audience could readily distinguish between the reality stuff from the fantasy stuff. So the question then becomes, what sort of fairy space will audiences relate to as the 1950s progresses?